When Japanese soldiers surrendered to American forces in the Pacific, they were stripped of weapons, pride, and, in their minds, honor. In Japanese culture, capture was disgraceful. They expected cruelty, starvation, maybe even execution. But when the trucks rolled into American camps, something unexpected happened. Instead of blows or insults, they were handed food, bread, meat stew, fruit, even coffee. Later, some were given cigarettes, chewing gum, even candy. For men who had grown used to chewing stale rice grains and dreaming of tobacco, this was unthinkable. Their enemy, the Americans, treated them better than their own commanders had. The irony only deepened as letters came from home. Families in Japan described starvation, shortages, and children going hungry, while prisoners wrote the unbelievable truth. They were gaining weight in captivity, smoking, and even tasting chocolate for the first time in their lives. It was a culture shock that none of them ever forgot. And it raises a remarkable question. Why did America give comfort to men who had once sworn to fight to the death against them? To understand why Japanese prisoners were so shocked when they first received food and cigarettes in American camps, we have to look at the world they came from. By the final years of the war, Japanese soldiers were already fighting with their stomachs half empty. Supplies never matched the demands of the front. Rice, once the heartbeat of every meal, was rationed to thin handfuls. Meat, sugar, and fruit became luxuries most never saw. Soldiers often boiled grass or tree bark to soften hunger, and cigarettes, once a common comfort, became almost mythical. Men would roll leaves in scraps of paper and pretend they were smoking tobacco just to feel normal again. The Imperial Army demanded endurance. It was drilled into every man: survive on less, endure starvation, embrace suffering as proof of loyalty. In training schools and on the front, officers told recruits that to beg for food or cigarettes showed weakness. Better to suffer in silence than to admit need. And so they did. On jungled islands, prisoners chewed stale grains from mouldy sacks. In Manchuria and Burma, soldiers staggered on rations so thin their uniforms hung off their bones. Civilians back in Japan fared little better. Letters from home told of families rationing drops of soy sauce, of mothers grinding millet into rough paste to stretch meals. By 1944, many Japanese households endured hunger daily. With this background, captured soldiers walked into American captivity, convinced starvation would be their fate. They thought their enemy would punish them with hunger, the slowest and cruelest death of all. Then came the shock. Inside US camps, prisoners received trays stacked with bread, steaming bowls of stew filled with meat and potatoes, cups of hot coffee. Some were given fruit apples, oranges, bananas. For men who hadn't seen fruit in years, the taste was almost unreal. They stared at the trays in disbelief. At first, many thought it was a trick. One prisoner later wrote, "I believed the food was only for show, and tomorrow they would starve us." But tomorrow came, and the food was given again. Meanwhile, American guards handed out small luxuries cigarettes, sometimes freely offered, sometimes part of the daily rations. For Japanese soldiers who had long since forgotten the taste of tobacco, these rolled sticks of leaf seemed like treasures. Imagine the sensation of lighting that first cigarette after months of deprivation, the harsh smoke filling your lungs, the relief spreading through your body. What should have been punishment had become, inconceivably, relief. The cultural clash was profound. Their own army had told them endurance meant honor, that suffering was expected, even necessary. Now, in the hands of the enemy, they were not only fed, but comforted. Every cigarette, every bowl of soup challenged the lessons of a lifetime. The astonishment grew as letters arrived from Japan. Families described bare shelves, ration cards, constant hunger. Mothers saved scraps so children might have one extra bite of rice. and yet their captured sons behind American barbed wire were eating meat 3 times a day and smoking genuine cigarettes. The irony cut deep. Some prisoners admitted to guilt shame that they were eating when their families starved. But guilt did not erase disbelief. The enemy who was supposed to treat them like animals had fed them like men. And as weeks passed, men who had arrived skeletal and bitterly thin began regaining strength. Their cheeks filled out, their hands stopped trembling. They laughed quietly at first, then openly bonding over trays of bread or the simple act of passing a cigarette down a row of bunk beds. It was an irony beyond comprehension. The enemy provided a life of routine meals, luxuries, even kindness when their own officers had taught only deprivation. If the first shock of captivity was being handed cigarettes and bread, the lasting astonishment came with the daily meals. In America's camps, food was not occasional charity. It was structured, regular, and almost alarmingly plentiful. For men who had once measured their portions by grains of rice, sitting down to 3 meals a day felt impossible to believe. The American military system ran on order, and order meant every prisoner was fed on schedule, regardless of rank or status. A typical tray might feature stew thick with chunks of beef or pork, potatoes soft but filling, slices of wheat bread, and a cup of coffee strong enough to jolt even the most exhausted soldier. Sometimes fruit appeared, an apple resting beside the bread, its glossy red skin a colour rarely seen in wartime Japan. For men who had lived on boiled millet or watery rice gruel, biting into that first apple was a memory seared into them for life. Prisoners often stared at the food before eating, unsure whether to dig in or to wait for the trick to be revealed. They whispered to each other, "Surely this was only temporary. Surely tomorrow the Americans would take it away." But tomorrow came, and the same trays were delivered again. The astonishment deepened into something else, quiet acceptance that they were being nourished by their enemy. Coffee alone was a revelation. The smell of roasted beans drifted through the camp kitchens each morning, intoxicating prisoners who had never tasted it before. Some described coffee as bitter, others as life-changing. One man said later, "It was like drinking strength itself. We thought only Americans lived with such things every day." The menu shifted occasionally to other staples: meatloaf, scrambled eggs, beans, cornbread, sometimes rice and vegetables tailored for foreign tastes. Prisoners noted the sheer variety, something that stood in sharp contrast to the monotony of their army rations. And then there was sugar found in jam spread thin across bread, or in small chunks of candy distributed in canteens. For Japanese prisoners, sugar was almost mythical by the 1940s. It had disappeared entirely from most households in Japan. To taste something sweet under American captivity felt so incongruous that many wrote about it years later. It wasn't just the food itself, it was what the food represented. The abundance, the reliability, the sheer ordinariness of it to the Americans. Guards and cooks dished it out without hesitation, as though it were obvious even an enemy prisoner deserved to eat. For men raised to expect misery in captivity, this casual generosity was always tinged with disbelief. The irony struck hardest when letters trickled from Japan. Families wrote of children growing thin, of ration tickets failing to provide even rice, of standing in line for hours only to leave with scraps. Civilians spoke of trading precious belongings on black markets to buy a few vegetables. Meanwhile, prisoners wrote cautiously back that they had food too much detail risked censorship, but between the lines it was clear. They were not starving. Some admitted they were gaining back lost weight. One diary recorded with a tone of disbelief, "Today we ate meat. Not scraps, real meat. It has been years. Tomorrow we may eat the same again. At home my family fights over beans. Here, in enemy hands, we are stronger. The cigarettes only deepened the strangeness. In the camps, packets of American tobacco brands passed through like currency. Prisoners shared smokes in the evening, sitting on bunks or leaning against fences, their faces lit faintly by glowing tips. Some guards handed cigarettes out casually, a gesture many Japanese prisoners described as surreal. One said later, "A cigarette in the jungle was the gift of life." Here the enemy gave them as if they were endless. This generosity extended even to treats once unimaginable: chewing gum, chocolate bars, occasionally Coca Cola. For men who had been told Americans were crude, the simple sweetness of gum or the fizz of soda became symbols of a kind of wealth and abundance they could hardly grasp. Together, this daily rhythm of food and luxuries created a profound contradiction. They were prisoners, confined behind wire, far from home. Yet in key ways, they lived healthier, sweeter lives than their families on the outside. Mothers and children in Hiroshima begged for food. Sons and fathers in Arkansas lit American cigarettes and ate stew. The irony haunted them, and yet it was real, undeniable. If American meals shocked the prisoners, the small luxuries amazed them even more. Cigarettes quickly became the most desired item in the camps. To Japanese prisoners, tobacco had almost vanished by the final years of the war. Supplies had collapsed, and whatever small amounts existed were hoarded by officers. Ordinary soldiers often went months without even catching the scent of smoke. Some had taken to rolling dried leaves or scraps of newspaper just to remember the habit. In the jungles, to find even a few crushed bits of tobacco was a moment of celebration. So when American guards and canteens distributed cigarettes freely, it hardly seemed real. Prisoners often lit their first cigarette in disbelief, holding it carefully, as though afraid it might disappear. They drew in the smoke with silent gratitude, some even shaking as they inhaled. What had been a forgotten memory suddenly returned in their enemy's camp. Even more surprising, cigarettes were not scarce. They circulated daily, bought with coupons, traded in barracks, and shared among friends. A man with two could hand one to his comrade, and the sight of prisoners passing cigarettes across bunks became routine. Soon, cigarettes grew into a kind of currency. Work details, favors, and even small personal goods could be traded for a smoke. To men who had once dreamed of finding a single cigarette on a muddy battlefield, this abundance seemed impossible to believe. But the surprises did not stop there. Chewing gum found its way into the camps, a product unfamiliar to most Japanese soldiers. At first, many did not know what to do with it, biting cautiously, expecting it to crumble like hard candy. Laughter spread as news circulated. Gum was meant to last, to be chewed for hours. The flavor, sweet and refreshing, left many prisoners marveling. It seemed such a frivolous creation, a treat that carried no nourishment, no practical value, and yet was enjoyed across America in endless supply. For men raised on rationing, gum became one of the strangest luxuries of captivity. Then came chocolate. Few prisoners had even seen it before, let alone tasted it. In wartime Japan, cacao was a foreign rarity, enjoyed only by the wealthiest before supplies vanished entirely. In American captivity, small chocolate bars appeared in canteens or as rations. The taste struck them with disbelief, sweet, rich, melting quickly on the tongue. In diaries, some prisoners recorded that it was the first time they had ever tasted chocolate, and they never forgot it. Coca Cola was another revelation. Striped glass bottles occasionally arrived in camps, carried in supply trucks. To open one, to hear the hiss of carbonation release, to taste the sweet fizz, it was more than a drink. To prisoners, it was an emblem of a society overflowing with abundance. In a world where they had fought over scraps of rice, America had bottled bubbly sweetness as casually as water. These luxuries carried meaning far beyond their sugar or tobacco. They were symbols. Each cigarette, each stick of gum, each chocolate bar whispered the same message. America was wealthy, confident, and unshaken by the war. If a nation could hand its enemies candy in the midst of global conflict, what did that say about the scale of its resources? Prisoners compared these gifts to the letters they received from home. Families wrote of children never tasting sweets, of fathers longing for a simple smoke, of hunger gnawing day by day. And yet their captured sons were unwrapping chocolate, biting gum, and smoking daily. The irony brought guilt, but also undeniable wonder. For many of these men, these luxuries became some of the clearest memories of captivity. Long after the war, former prisoners would tell their families the same stories. How their first cigarette in months came from an American guard. How they chewed gum and laughed at its strangeness. How they tasted chocolate as prisoners, but not as free men. It was these tiny, ordinary items, so common in American life, that left some of the deepest marks in memory. Food had kept them alive, but cigarettes, gum, and chocolate, those showed them a glimpse of another world. A world where even an enemy's prison offered more abundance than their own nation had ever provided. In the end, what Japanese prisoners remembered most about their time in American camps was not only the fences or the guards, it was the taste of food and the curl of smoke from a cigarette. They came expecting humiliation and hunger. Instead, they walked into canteens where trays were filled with meat, bread, fruit, and coffee. They lit cigarettes handed freely by the very soldiers who had captured them. They chewed gum and laughed at its sweetness. They unwrapped chocolate bars like treasures and sipped Coca Cola with childlike amazement. These small, ordinary American comforts became extraordinary shocks for men raised to believe captivity would strip them of everything. The shock was sharper still because of what they heard from home. Families wrote desperate letters from Japan, describing bare cupboards, ration cards, and children going to bed hungry. Mothers saved scraps for their youngest, while fathers traded belongings to buy vegetables on black markets. Meanwhile, their captured sons admitted quietly, often with shame, that they were gaining weight, eating 3 meals a day, even smoking and tasting luxuries their families had never known. For some, this generosity was confusing. Why would an enemy offer small pleasures to those who had fought against them? Was it strategy, propaganda, or simply the natural wealth of a nation untouched by the kind of hunger that ravaged Asia? Whatever the reason, the impact was lasting. Decades later, former prisoners smiled wistfully as they told their children of these moments. The first smoke after months of deprivation, the laughter over a stick of gum, the shock of chocolate melting on the tongue. For men who had once believed America was cruel and uncivilized, these small courtesies created memories that lingered long after the war. Perhaps that is the great irony of their captivity. In the darkest moment of defeat, they discovered unexpected kindness not through grand gestures, but through the simple act of being fed, of being given the small luxuries that made them feel human again. As one prisoner reflected years later, I thought I would die cursing the enemy. Instead, I remember my first apple, my first chocolate, and the cigarette an American guard pressed into my hand. For men who expected punishment, the shock was generosity. For soldiers who braced for cruelty, the surprise was dignity. And for many, what they remembered most of America was not the barbed wire, but the food, the cigarettes, and the strange taste of kindness from an enemy they never forgot.